It is 7 o'clock. Good to see you this morning. Rishi's rewiring is what the Chancellor is calling it. He's about to reveal a plan for financial firms to get greener and transition to net zero. But a warning this morning from the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action, Mark Carney, who told us that it's not easy and that one of the main problems is that banks that finance the fossil fuel industry. Under the Chancellor's plans, companies in charge of around 40% of the world's financial assets will align themselves with global climate goals. Greenwashing, where companies say they're doing more to protect the environment than they actually are, will be guarded against. And Rishi Sunak will reveal plans for the UK to become the world's first net zero financial centre. Let's head straight to Glasgow, where, of course, the COP26 summit continues. Our correspondent, Ashna Huranag, is standing by. Ashna, lovely to see you this morning. Well, take us through it. What we're going to be hearing from the Chancellor.
A very good morning to you. Yes, it's going to be all about cash today. Throughout this whole conference so far, we know it's been a bit of a balance, really, between cash and climate commitments. Those developing nations really wanting more money from those bigger, richer nations. And today, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak is going to be taking centre stage and saying that he wants the UK to become the central financial centre. He says he wants to combine big businesses, big institutions like universities, civil society groups, and other industry regulators to bring them together and make them make some very serious commitments about the climate going forward, but more importantly, the money that's going to be pumped into it. As I mentioned, it has been this toss-up so far between these climate commitments, these promises from these nations, lots of dates being thrown around. India hoping to go net zero by 2070, China by 2060. And this whole, I guess the reason we're here today is to talk about the money behind that, how much is being pumped into those developing nations to help them get there as quickly as possible. These plans that Rishi Sunak is going to announce, is going to be about high-level targets. We're hearing more on that from the Minister a little bit later on. But leaders have headed home now after this barrage of announcements that they made over the last 2 days. Yesterday, we saw billions being invested in deforestation, the idea of restoring the rainforests and the forests, not only in Norway, but places like Indonesia and Brazil as well. Yesterday, we also heard announcements on clean technology, how the UK is going to be fronting that, but also the US and China deciding they're going to take centre stage with that announcement too. But hopefully today it will be all about the money.
Ashna, thanks very much indeed. Let's get the view of our business correspondent. Helen Smith is here in the studio. Morning, Helen. Look, I suppose there is an issue. If you are going to be going after financial centres like the United Kingdom and their investment in fossil fuels and so on, well, it's part of the raison d'etre, isn't it, for banks to chase the money? And there is still plenty of money in this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it's a real recognition, I think, from the Chancellor today and others gathered there, that if you don't tackle the money, it's going to be really difficult to tackle the bigger problem, because while there's money still to be made, organisations will, as you say, chase that money. And in terms of sorting out the money, it's not just, as Ashna was saying there, getting money to some of those developing economies, but it's also cleaning up the money that exists in financial centres like here in London. It's about making sure that money is not going towards things like fossil fuel companies, deforestation, to make sure it is going towards things like greener, cleaner energy. Now, there was a few things today, Niall, so I'm just going to unpack them. Firstly, let's take a look at the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, very catchily named. Yeah. What it is, a collection of banks, financial institutions, investors. They've essentially agreed to come together in a coalition to not finance the wrong things, essentially to align themselves, according to the rhetoric, to those net zero promises. And there's a lot of the world's financial assets that are included under this. 40% of the world's financial assets run by about 450 companies that have all agreed to be part of this. The Chancellor also wants the UK to be the first financial centre to be aligned to net zero. He wants to start mandating that companies publish their net zero commitments where they've made them, so that this greenwashing we've heard so much about can start to be gotten rid of. And then there's a chunk of money as well to developing economies. So lots and lots there. Now, climate campaigners, many of them are saying that this is all well and good, these announcements, but where they ask are the teeth to this. Because although there's a lot of commitments, there's not a lot of mandating going on. All of these companies have agreed to be part of this organisation. There's nothing to stop or ban them from financing coal. There is no mandate to make a net zero promise. There might soon be a mandate to start publishing what you're doing, not a mandate to make it in the first place. So a lot of people saying there needs to be more regulation to really control some of this finance.
Helen, thank you very much indeed. More from you later in the programme. But let's talk to someone who, well, one hopes will know much more about it than us. John Glenn, the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, joining us from Glasgow. Very good to see you this morning, Minister. Let's start with just that which we were discussing with Helen Ann. Take us through this plan for the first net zero financial centre.
Well, at Paris 6 years ago, we made massive political commitments, and governments can provide billions, but financial services firms can provide trillions. But what we want to do is actually give people confidence in that journey to net zero. Many have made that commitment to net zero by 2050. But what today we're announcing is that we will get a task force together and in the next 12 months establish the regulations, the journey, the pathway to deliver that, and the milestones and conditions that people will need to display in order to give credibility to those goals. That will make us the first jurisdiction in the world to have that net zero obligation for financial services, and we're a massive financial services centre in London, and it's important that we take the lead globally on this matter.
Indeed it is. I just suppose the question, as I was discussing with Helen Ann, is where the level of compulsion is towards those institutions that in the past have benefited from, on the one hand, talking up their green credentials. But, you know, take, for example, Barclays Bank. They've financed $5.6 billion worth in new fossil fuel projects since January, more than any other UK bank. So where does the pressure come from, aside from public pressure?
Well, there's enormous pressure to be accountable to those goals that they've committed to. And I think we need to recognise that this is about a transition. It's an urgent transition, but it's clear that we can't immediately, overnight, stop investment in some sources of energy. But what we need to have is a credible way of measuring the transition to net zero, which many of these firms, covering 130 trillion of assets, have committed to. And if you look at what the Committee on Climate Change says, they recognise that though we're moving rapidly to renewables, there will need to be this transition. What we're announcing today will give credibility to that transition journey for those firms that control that massive amount, 130 trillion of the world's assets.
But Minister, sorry if I'm repeating the question. What will we do if they don't live up to commitments that, let's be fair, they have made in the past? Yeah. I mean, Becky Jarvis from the Bank on Our Future describes these announcements as, well, commitments a mile wide and an inch deep. So there has to be, at some point, some mechanism other than simply public pressure by which we can compel those financial institutions to do that which they promised.
Well, in the last 18 months, we've seen a massive increase in the commitments made by financial services firms. To make good on those, to have credibility as institutions, there will need to be an agreed set of ways of reporting that transition. So within 12 months, we will have those plans ready. We will then legislate for them in order that people can have confidence in the journey that these firms are speaking to. Because I do recognise the scepticism that exists, and it's of course no good if people are claiming to get to net zero by 2050, but there's no credible information that is verifiable on that journey. That will be what we will be working on, and that will be people from academia, from NGOs, from industry, from government, regulators, to get this right, and that's what we'll be working on over the next 12 months.
What does all this mean for the tens of thousands, potentially actually hundreds of thousands of people who work in industries such as oil and gas, and of course the related services attached to them?
Well, we know that we've got to transition urgently to net zero, but we also know that in the interim we will have some degree of reliance on the less clean energies. And what it means is that those firms that employ many people are actively engaged on that journey to transition. So if you take companies like BP, they're using their profits to adapt their businesses to serve the renewable imperative in the years ahead. They're doing that urgently, and what today's about is giving some confidence around how those plans are actually put into milestones that lead to the outcomes that they are aiming for.
How does this square with the freezing of fuel duty, the cutting of air passenger duty for domestic flights last week? It seems, on the one hand, talking up our commitment to getting to net zero as soon as possible, but on the other hand, making it easier for people to continue to pollute.
Well, we did freeze fuel duty for the 12th year in succession last week, because we also have to recognise the pressures that exist on families in their everyday living. Government has to take a range of decisions, and that's what the Chancellor did. We made some changes to the domestic APD, but we also introduced an increase to the super long haul for the longer flights. So we have to balance these decisions, but make no mistake, this government is committed to that net zero goal. We were the first country to legislate to go net zero by 2050, and today's plans are about actually giving that pathway that people can have confidence in. But government has to make complex decisions at every fiscal event, and we need to do the right thing by the British people.
What effect do you think this will have on financial institutions in places, for example, like China and Russia?
Well, China and Russia, we want them to make stronger commitments. This conference is about getting a consensus on that journey. We obviously want to do that by persuasion, of course we do, and we hope that the consensus that is building, that we had at Paris, will move them to make further steps in due course. But what's important too is that we in the United Kingdom show leadership, and we show leadership as a financial centre in going to net zero rapidly with verifiable plans and journeys for firms to explain how they're going to achieve that. There is massive public appetite for the removal of greenwashing as a concept, and for people to be really clear, for firms to be really clear and be accountable for what they're actually doing and what they're investing in and how they're going to achieve that net zero goal by 2050.
Indeed. Minister, I wonder if we can turn our attention to COVID, because quite clearly the situation is not great as regards the virus this morning. As things stand, the UK's weekly death rate is 3 times the level of other major European nations. Hospitalisations, 6 times the rate on the continent. The UK has currently roughly as many daily COVID deaths as Germany, France and Italy put together. When the Prime Minister was challenged by CNN's Christian Amanpour about the UK being the worst in Europe, he said that he disputed that. On what basis does he dispute that?
Well, the government is monitoring the situation very carefully. We've obviously gone through a whole journey in terms of dealing with COVID. We have announced the need to have the booster and the need to make those walk-in centres available for people to take that booster jab.
Sure. Sorry to interrupt, Minister, but just on a simple statement of fact, on what basis did the Prime Minister challenge Christian Amanpour's suggestion that we are the worst in Europe? I've just given you the statistics. It seems pretty clear to me.
Well, I think our vaccine rate and has been very impressive. In terms of the trajectory of how things are going to play out, we're obviously working with advisors from SAGE and from health experts to look at what steps we need to take, and we monitor this very carefully. The imperative at the moment is to get people to take these booster jabs and ensure that we are as prepared as we can be for the challenges that lie ahead.
Well, there's at least one member of SAGE that you're no longer working with. So Jeremy Farrar has resigned his position on that. We know that he was advocating for Vaccine Plus in terms of the strategy moving forward. Just given where we are in terms of hospitalisations, in terms of death rates, why are we not doing, as people like Sir Jeremy Farrar have argued in the past, and moving to Plan B immediately?
Well, government discusses these matters on an almost daily basis. There is a committee of ministers that meet to discuss this, and decisions will be looked at on a rolling basis. And obviously there are a range of views, and further restrictions also have consequences for people's lives as well. And so all of these things need to be weighed up, and we look at all advice very seriously before we take very serious decisions. So
at what point then is Plan B triggered? I mean, this is a question that I've asked a number of government ministers. We've never really had a clear answer on this. At what point do hospitalisations or the mortality rate get insufferable, so much so that we move to Plan B? When does that happen?
Well, the data points vary across the country, and the committees of government ministers that meet to discuss it take advice from public health experts and the wider health community as to what is the best way forward. But there are a number of things to consider with respect to how we move forward, and those matters are under review constantly.
Would it not be better then to be absolutely crystal clear with the public and explain to them at what point they should expect, and there is an expectation building now that Plan B will come, it's just when it comes, that they would have a clear idea as to when they should expect these further measures to be reintroduced?
Well, as I said, the imperative for the government at the moment is to get this booster rollout accelerated so we can be in a position where as many people are in the best place possible. We look at these things across a number of data points, and we will make decisions in due course, as we have done throughout this crisis.
I wonder if we might talk for a second, Minister, about your colleague Owen Paterson, who, of course, has been censured by the Sanders Committee. What is the government's current position? We are told, and my colleague Tamara Cohen has just found this, the government is going to has concerns about the standard system, that they've been bubbling away for a while. This is the straw that broke the camel's back. Is the party going to be supporting the Andrea Leadsom amendment that would, in essence, allow Mr Paterson to not face the punishment, to not face the censure?
Well, forgive me, I'm here in Glasgow at COP. I am aware of the concerns around the process of the procedure committee and the investigation that led to the recommendation. But this will be a matter that my colleagues in Parliament will be looking at today. And the amendment will be discussed in due course in Parliament. It's a procedural matter for the House of Commons. That's what's we're talking about here, over the apparent fairness of the way that investigation was undertaken. That's the concern that I think colleagues across the House have, and it will be examined in the House of Commons today.
But just in terms of that process, indeed, I spoke to Owen Paterson back in April on this programme, in depth, in fact, about the suicide of his wife and his charitable efforts. And frankly, it's an interview that will remain with me for a very long time. I'm very sympathetic to the situation in which Mr Paterson finds himself. However, when you look at the committee report, it says this: no previous case of paid advocacy has seen so many breaches or such a clear pattern of behaviour in failing to separate private and public interest. The committee was absolutely certain of his guilt in all of this. I'm just wondering on what basis the Conservative government feels it is appropriate to circumvent the conclusions of that committee.
Well, as I said, it's a matter for the House of Commons to respond to that report. And it's also a matter of concern around the procedure leading up to that report making those conclusions. And I think most people would agree that when there is a dispute over someone's conduct, there's got to be fair and due process before an outcome and a determination of the consequences is made. I think that's the area that the House of Commons, across all parties, will want to look at today.
But just to pick you up, you've mentioned it a couple of times. What is the evidence that the process has not been fair? Well,
I mean, Owen Paterson has made some comments around what he experienced through the course of a very long investigation. And this will be something that the House of Commons will debate today. But please forgive me, I'm here in Glasgow at COP, here to talk to you about the transition to net zero. I won't be in the House of Commons today, and consequently I don't feel equipped to give you a detailed readout on that matter.
Minister, well, I hope you feel that we did spend at least a few questions talking about your brief. Thanks very much for your time this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, let's bring in our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen, who, of course, as mentioned in that interview, whilst I'm live on air, broke that particular line. Just tell us exactly what you know, Tamara, and what we can make of that which we heard from the Minister. As he says, he is in Glasgow. This came up mid-interview, but frankly, if he hadn't been briefed on it, I'd be very surprised.
So what I understand, Neil, is that today MPs will be voting on the suspension of Owen Paterson, the former cabinet minister accused in that report of this egregious case of paid advocacy, the Standards Commissioner who regulates the behaviour of MPs, has said. So he was recommended to have a 30-day suspension, which is a very serious punishment, and MPs are due to vote on that today. Now, allies of Owen Paterson have put forward an amendment, an alternative, and what that says, and they're led by Andrea Leadsom, also a former cabinet minister and an influential figure, they say, let's pause the decision on Owen Paterson while the whole standards system is overhauled, because the key thing that John Glenn, the Treasury Minister, said there is that there have been concerns about the procedures for a while. It's not just this case. I'm told that there have been concerns bubbling away for some time about how these cases are looked at, and in particular how long they take to rule on, and the idea that MPs are not allowed to discuss them while these long investigations are going on. So what Andrea Leadsom is suggesting is that they put the result of that report aside for 3 months while a senior Conservative looks at how the standard system is working and overhauls it. So the idea is that this motion does not decide on the guilt or innocence of Owen Paterson. It just looks at how the whole standards system is working. Now, that attempt has attracted 60 signatures already from Conservative MPs, all different kinds of Conservative MPs, not just traditional allies of Owen Paterson. So it's obviously got a lot of support in the Conservative Party, and I understand that the Prime Minister and the government will be supporting it. So I think what we can expect today is the government machine throwing its support behind Owen Paterson and this idea that the standard system needs to be overhauled. Now, Labour have been saying that this is an outrageous attempt to overrule the independent standards commissioner. So I think we're set for a big battle over this in Parliament today, but the government, it sounds like, throwing its weight behind Mr Paterson.
And Tamara, whilst we have you, in terms of that which we discussed with the Minister about, well, financial centres heading towards net zero, there's a bit of detail there, but the one thing we didn't get was, well, at what point, if they don't do what they say they're going to do, can we compel them to do it?
Yes, I think it is a big moment that that financial institutions have to publish what they're going to do towards getting to net zero. In the past, they've just been allowed to say we are getting towards net zero without having to prove anything. So it is a big step, but of course the monitoring of how they do it will be crucial. But I think for Rishi Sunak to announce this step, which I think he feels the UK government is leading the world on that, and it's something that Mark Carney, former Governor of the Bank of England, now working in the field of climate change, has called for. They will feel that this is a big step to be taken at COP26 today, and they'll be assessing the reaction from other countries.
Tamara, thanks very much. Let's continue discussing COP26 and, of course, that which we heard from the Minister with our business correspondent, Helen Smith. I mean, Helen, we were just talking, whilst we were listening to Tamara there, it does come down to an extent to the idea of how will we be able to enforce this? I mean, we've had banks, Paris was signed 6 years ago. Lots of banks attended at that point, made much of their green credentials and then continued to stick trillions of dollars into fossil fuels.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's that lack of mandate, the lack of teeth, if you like, to some of these proposals that's really been what a lot of climate campaigners and others have picked up on this morning. To take, for example, this Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, that's the organisation of banks and financial institutions gathered together by former Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, to align themselves, as he says, to the commitments of net zero. That's all well and good, and it's very, very positive in a sense. There's a huge proportion of the world's financial assets that will be contained under that are controlled by the companies that have signed up. But there is no mandate, there's no regulation, there's no actual rules to say if you finance, for example, a company involved in destructive agribusiness or deforestation, or a company involved in fossil fuel production. There is absolutely no specific rules or legislation to stop that or to bring any sort of sanctions if a company were to do that. Similarly, Rishi Sunak as well, wants to sort of bring forward the mandating of companies publishing their net zero plans. And that is very important, don't get me wrong. They really want to tackle this issue of greenwashing, the issue of companies making a few sort of announcements that sound kind of green and then still kind of behaving in a way that's not as green as they say it is. And it's important to tackle that. But a lot of people are saying it's all well and good mandating companies to publish their net zero commitments, but there is currently no mandate at all for companies to make a net zero commitment in the first place. So you know, that it's all positive, of course, and tackling the money really, really matters. But just to take an example, just last month we at Sky News, we did an exclusive story in collaboration with an organisation called Global Witness about the amount of finance that is still travelling from centres like Europe, like America, to companies that are involved in deforestation. Hundreds of billions of pounds still channeling to companies that fund deforestation, despite many of these banks having anti-deforestation policies. So just a small example about how much work there is still to do.
Yeah, for the time being, at least, greed rather than green appears to be good, doesn't it? Helen Ant, thanks very much indeed. Well, in his speech this morning, Rishi Sunak will say that he wants to rewire the entire global financial system for net zero. But how will that work in reality? Well, let's speak to Ashish Joshi joining us from the Maldives. And Ashish, where you are, and we've been listening to your coverage all this week from the beaches and the islands of Mauritius, what do they need to ensure their long-term survival? And indeed, do the financial markets crop up in their discussions?
Finance crops up in discussions a lot. There's been a few times when I've spoken to senior ministers and government here, and they have reiterated their need for access to funds. The $100 billion that was pledged 6 years ago in Paris simply hasn't been made available to developing nations. We heard the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, talking about the most vulnerable low-lying islands that need desperate help, and you can't have really a better example than here in the Maldives. They rely so heavily on tourism. It's 30% of their GDP. We've been through a pandemic when tourism stopped. They've taken a massive hit on their own finances here in this country, and all at the same time, they have to keep looking at how they shore up their coastal defences. That takes a lot of money. They have to reinvest now in the tourism sector to encourage tourists to come here. They are expanding the airport, they are building new resorts. They have to, because that is what drives the Maldivian economy. It would be foolish to think that that would have to stop, because there are countries around the world who can manage both, who can still have green economies and still grow their GDP, as well as having a vibrant tourism sector. And that's what the Maldives needs. So when I speak to people here, they say it's really difficult because we need to spend money on protecting our islands, building up the infrastructure around to make sure that our coral reefs, which are suffering severe degradation, are protected. They are worried about rising sea levels. They have to compensate families and farmers who are affected by rising sea levels. People who lose their homes are under threat of relocation. They've got to find other places for them to live. There are schools along the shoreline which need help as well. So they'll look at Glasgow and they'll know that they want more money, but they want access to this money too.
Ashish Joshi in the Maldives, not Mauritius. I know you get around, but it's definitely the Maldives. Thanks very much indeed. Well, let's bring in Neville Lazarus, who is in Delhi for us this morning. And, of course, Narendra Modi heading back there, having made a pretty significant commitment, but not a commitment that goes as far as many would have wanted.
That's right, net zero by 2017, 20 years beyond the international deadline. But it's also he's also committed to some other major commitments. One was that all 50% of India's energy by 2030 will come from non-fossil fuels, an increase of about 500 gigawatts of renewable energy also by 2030. Now, these are very big and ambitious plans which are very big in scale and scope, and there is a lot of opportunities for technology companies and green technology to come and invest in this country. That is what also the government's looking for. He is also fighting the corner for developing countries in terms of finances and transfer of green technology, which developed countries have pledged. India is a vast country. The grid network is quite broken. The finances are in shambles, and there is a lot of scope for improvement out there. This mainly due to electoral politics, where subsidies are given for votes. But Prime Minister Modi putting his putting himself on the forefront in front of world leaders, talking about his commitment. He has a majority in Parliament. He is known to be a strong and decisive leader. He has taken some unpopular decisions, which has created some sort of political backlash in this country for him, but he has not wavered from them, and a lot of leaders will be looking at that for him, adhering to all the commitments that he has made. Now, India has also, and he himself has often spoken about how India has been on track to the Paris Agreement targets and is going beyond that. He is investing a lot in renewable energy, particularly in the solar sector, but he will be held accountable, and India will be held accountable to all the commitments that they have made.
Neville, thanks very much indeed. A little bit of breaking news reaching us, and it regards the ongoing, how best to put this, discussions between the British government and the French over fishing. We've been hearing from the French Transport Minister. Sounds like a bit of good news. He says that the UK has shown a constructive spirit regarding the talks over Brexit and indeed fishing licences. We'll dig a little bit into that. Bring you more after this. Welcome back. It is day 3 in the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, and there have already been a number of announcements. So, are the politicians making meaningful progress? Someone I'm sure with a view on this, Tom Rivett-Carnac, previously the chief political strategist for the Paris Agreement at the UN. Tom, great to see you this morning. And before we kind of delve into the announcements that have already been made, just a question of procedure, given your experience with Paris. Now that the leaders have left, is this when the real work starts to get done?
Well, in many ways that's true, although the last 2 days have been critical. I mean, world leaders have been here, biggest gathering of world leaders since the Paris Agreement 6 years ago. It's been a remarkable signal of political intent. And actually what was critical is before they left, Alok Sharma, the COP president, spoke to the world leaders and he said, you have to leave your ministers and your negotiators with a strong mandate to now go forward and do the work to find the agreements necessary. That's really important he did that, because what that means is there's now enough latitude left here in Glasgow to actually reach agreement where we have to.
Well, on the basis of that which we have heard so far, I mean, what has been the personal highlight for you?
Well, I mean, I have to say, I've gone on a bit of an emotional roller coaster. I think when we started on Sunday looking at the G20, I felt pretty anxious. There were some statements coming out that it didn't go far enough. We didn't get that clear clarion call that actually made me feel sure that we were going to get to where we wanted to. But a few days later, I'm actually feeling much better. I mean, we've seen leaders come out and actually recommit to 1.5 degrees as a threshold. Remember, coming out of Paris, we said 2 degrees with best efforts to 1.5. We're now sharpening that to saying it has to be 1.5. And we know that's the case from a scientific perspective. And beyond that, I'd say there's been 3 things that have been really critical. The first thing is that there has been new net zero commitments from countries like India and a range of others that now means that 89% of global emissions are covered by a net zero target. That's amazing. That's up from just around 50% at the beginning of this year. That's huge progress. The second thing is these big commitments on deforestation. We have tried for years to integrate deforestation into the climate debate. You can't solve climate without stopping deforestation. Yesterday, we saw a real moment of clarity. I would say the beginning of the end of deforestation. 100 countries committing to end and reverse it by 2030 with some very clever market mechanisms, partnerships with the private sector to make that happen. And the third thing is in methane. I mean, it doesn't sound that exciting, but reducing methane is, in a way, the best way, well, it absolutely is, the best way that we can avoid global heating in this decade. And there, 105 countries have come together to make a commitment to really take action. We're not there yet. It's only day 3, and there's a long way to go, but I'm feeling much better than I did 2 days ago.
Well, allow me to inject a dose of cynicism into all of this then. You mentioned India a second ago, and of course their commitment to be net zero by 2070. We've also heard from the Chinese 2060. Significant steps forward, clearly, but isn't that because of where they started rather than where they're going? I mean, is it enough for India, one of the biggest polluters in the world, to be talking about 50 years from now?
It's a great question, and obviously it isn't enough. Like so much in climate change, it's transformative, it's remarkable, and it's nowhere near enough, and it can only be a beginning. So what we saw from India was the first time they put on the table a net zero goal, 2070. I agree, it's a long way away, it needs to be brought forward. But again, if you dig under that commitment, By the end of this decade, 50% of energy coming from non-fossil fuel sources. There's been some analysis done already that suggests that properly implemented, what that could mean is that India would peak their emissions in this decade. So you're absolutely right. It's not enough, and there's still a long way to go. The other reason that I would actually also bring for a bit of cynicism based on what I said at the beginning is monitoring. I mean, particularly on the deforestation commitment. In 2014, there was a big forest commitment made, and actually deforestation increased by more than 40% over the coming years amongst those countries that have made that commitment. So we have to approach this with a degree of, is this time really different? I think it is, partly because of the multitude of commitments that are actually going to change this, but also because technology has changed. We now have satellites all around the world. We can basically tell when a single tree is cut down. That's going to make it much more difficult to cheat on things like that, and ensuring that the payments for those services come after the restoration and the preservation has been made will also be critical.
Apologies, Tom. Cynicism round two here. Haven't we been here before? I mean, you were involved with Paris. Huge, historic agreement signed by the world, and then just a couple of years later, it was in tatters, it was in dust. These things can be incredibly fragile. Now, we're not expecting President Biden to sign it and then burn it just as soon as he gets back to the White House. That's not the current incumbent's position, but things have a habit of falling apart quite quickly.
Well, you're absolutely right, they can do, but I would just challenge what you just said in one specific way. The Paris Agreement sets in motion a process to completely transform the global economy by 2050, right? It's a net zero goal by 2050 with a series of 5-yearly commitments along the way. And I would say the experience of the last few years actually shows how robust it is. The world's largest economy pulled out for a few years. No one else said that they were going to pull out. Everybody stayed in. So what we're seeing here in Glasgow will not be enough to guarantee us to stay to 1.5 degrees of warming. That's absolutely clear. No individual conference can do that. What it can do is keep 1.5 front and centre, keep it on the table for us to move firmly in that direction in the future, and ensure that in the coming years we can really double down on those commitments to get to where we need to go.
Fair points all. Tom Ribbett-Carnac, great to have you on the programme this morning. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Well, as we've been hearing, some key deals have already been agreed in Glasgow. They include that pledge by many countries to cut methane emissions, as we were hearing, the biggest contributor to global warming. Well, they say they're going to cut those by at least 30% before the end of the decade. But it's how those promises are enforced in places like Texas, home to much of America's oil industry, which will determine just how successful this summit is. Sky's US correspondent Mark Stone reports from the Permian Basin in Texas.
If America is to lead the way in cutting emissions of a gas that's warming our planet more quickly than any other, well, then this is the front line. The Permian Basin, Texas. It's where the politicians' promises in Glasgow meet the reality on the ground.
Look how big that flare is from here.
We're with Sharon Wilson and her team of methane hunters. For well over a decade, they've been exposing this invisible, odorless polluter, and they are sceptical now that change is coming. We pull up alongside one of the thousands of oil facilities which dot this landscape. And with a specialist camera, Sharon shows us the problem.
Put it in high sensitivity mode. And if you want to just look.
Wow, so you can't see anything when you're looking with the naked eye, but as soon as you look through here, you could see quite clearly that there is vapor coming out of these tanks. Methane is a byproduct of oil extraction, and from the tanks holding the crude, it is seeping out. The operators are allowed to emit certain quantities of methane, but checks on what's actually happening are lax. And so it is the imagery from spot checks like this which Sharon has taken to Glasgow to focus minds. At another site, an unlit flare stack, and through Sharon's camera, the consequence is exposed. The flares are used to burn off the gas. So often, though, they are partially lit or not alight at all. And so it's released into the air and you can't see it. Why haven't they lit it?
I guess they don't have to. Who's going to make them light it? I've been reporting it to the state every time.
At a third site, more emissions from a flare stack. Sharon's research with others has concluded that 10% of flares are not lit or are partially lit. They say this means companies here are emitting up to 3.5 times more methane than was feared. And here, a leak too. We approached the companies who operate these plants. Only one responded, saying that they had found a leak on a tank that they'd sold recently to another operator. All this is a huge problem because the scientists say that over a 20-year period, methane is 80 times more potent at warming than CO2. In short, then, it is a very, very significant contributor to our warming planet. And the hope from those who are exposing the emissions is that they can show us all the scale and the impact.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Permian Basin International Oil Show.
But up the road in the local town, a trade fair hints at just how vital the oil industry is to this community. This is where the Biden administration's pledges to save the planet are up against local politics, jobs and people.
What is regulations going to do? I mean, how do you regulate the climate?
Every business in this area, whether it's directly related to the oil field or not, is going to be severely impacted if they shut any of it down.
What do you think of climate change?
I think it's bullshit. That's it.
Reducing methane emissions is a key component of America's pledges in Glasgow. Sharon has taken her research to Scotland, but she is not optimistic.
The Biden administration listens to the industry more than he listens to the people. And he wants to be seen as this compromiser, this big negotiator. But we're past all of that. We're past compromising.
It is so often the determination of just a few to expose the damage done by so many. But this is a toxic political climate. Exposure is one thing. Change is quite another. Mark Stone, Sky News, in the oil fields of Texas.
Now, Cabinet Ministers and senior Conservative MPs are calling on the ECB to take action into racism at Yorkshire County Cricket Club. The chair of the Culture Select Committee wants the entire Yorkshire board to quit after it ruled racially offensive language used to its player Azim Rafiq was simply banter. Let's get more on this now, Sky's Shaman Freeman-Powell joining us from the newsroom. Morning, Shaman. Take us through the story. What exactly is the position of the Yorkshire Cricket Board?
Good morning. Well, this is a story that has been rumbling on for quite some time now. But as you said, those senior politicians speaking out has made it a big story for this morning. So just for context, Azim Rafiq spoke out about his experience at Yorkshire County Cricket Club more than a year ago now. He spoke about bullying that he experienced, as well as what he described as deep-rooted racism, and said that at one point it got so bad that he was close to suicide. Now, there's no denying that this took place. The club admitted that it had happened and even apologised. But quite bizarrely, it seems that they put the racist slurs down to banter and no disciplinary action has been taken. And I think this is what's really angered people. As you say, Nadine Dorries, who is the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, has spoke out. She says that Azim Rafiq's treatment after the racism he faced was disgusting. She added that the investigation that followed only makes it even worse, and that she tagged the ECB, which is the governing body for cricket in England and Wales, and said that an investigation must be swift and fully transparent. And it clearly bothered Sajid Javid too. He tweeted that the racist language that he experienced was not banter and called for heads to roll at Yorkshire County Cricket Club. And so the ECB has since responded after Azim Rafiq commented about how long it had taken and has apologised. But it's yet to be seen whether this is a strong enough response, as I said, no disciplinary action has been taken yet.
Well, we will see. Shaman, thanks very much indeed. Stay where you are. Coming up after the break, I'll be finding out how Greece has managed to keep its tourism industry in business, despite the global pandemic.
The worst floods to hit Western Europe in a generation.
Rate of deforestation as its time is running out to halt the climate crisis.
2 months of rain in just 2 days.
We see the effects more and more.
Every house, block after block, was flooded.
Close to the peak.
Roads that have turned to rivers.
A global problem which requires a global solution.
A long, dangerous summer stretches ahead.
COP26. Full coverage on Sky News.
Well, we've been cutting carbon for 2 decades, Ian. Actually, I joined Google in 2007. I was a child, really. And in those days, we went carbon neutral. And then since then, what we've been doing is investing heavily in renewables. So 2017, we matched all of our electricity purchases globally with renewable energy, with a big investor in wind and solar and so on. And we've announced our plan to be carbon-free, only operating on renewables by 2030 in our campuses and data centres. The good news is, in 2 or 3 data centres in Europe, we're already running only on renewables over 90% of the time. So we're getting towards that. The last 10% is hard, but I think it's a really important thing for people to understand. Every time you search or watch a YouTube video, you're already carbon neutral, and we're well on the way to being carbon free. We're trying to help users make smarter choices too. So one of our pledges is to help 1 billion users using our products in their everyday lives to make smarter choices for the planet. So good example there is Google Maps. Probably the most useful thing we can do is show you the most eco-friendly route. And we're doing that. And so if the most eco-friendly route is very similar in time to the rest, we'll just give you that. If it's a bit of a difference in time, we'll show you the option, because sometimes you'll be able to make that choice. And we estimate that we could take the equivalent of 200,000 cars off the streets if people are using those kinds of tools. Or when you search for a product or a flight or a hotel, we want to be able to show you the more eco-friendly options. So that's one of the ways that we can help consumers make smarter choices. And by the way, we know that people really care. Over 70% of people in countries around the world care about and are fearful of the consequences of climate change. And that's why it's so urgent that we take action. It's clear that governments and companies and communities need to work together to do this. And that's why Google's trying to play its part. We're one of the world's biggest purchasers in the corporate sector of renewable energy. We're often the first investor in things like a wind or a solar farm, so that we bring new capacity online that others can benefit from. What we found is actually by doing that, we've reduced our energy costs. You know, these new renewables can be as cost efficient as older types of energy. And I think one of the key things at COP is for governments to give that framework for decarbonisation, for more finance to help to assist that transition, transparent carbon markets, and to incentivise innovation.
Welcome back. If you've been watching since the top of the hour, you'll recall I was speaking to the Government Minister this morning, doing the rounds, about Owen Paterson, Conservative MP, currently facing censure. Let's bring in our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen, to try and flesh out a little bit more of this story. Now, Tamara, there is to be a vote. To walk us through exactly what is happening today. It's all to do with an amendment being put forward by Andrea Leadsom, I think.
Yes, Owen Paterson, the former Cabinet Minister, was heavily criticised in a report last week for breaking the rules on paid lobbying when he was a consultant for 2 private companies. And the Standards Commissioner, who investigates these sort of claims, recommended that he be suspended from Parliament for 30 days, which is a really big deal, actually, because it could lead to a by-election in his constituency and him no longer being an MP. So MPs are voting on that today, and allies of Owen Paterson are really coming to his defence, including Andrea Leadsom, who is an influential Conservative herself, former Cabinet Minister, who has put up an amendment supported by a lot of Conservatives and, I can tell you today, supported by Boris Johnson and the whole government, which would put aside a decision on Owen Paterson's case while the entire standards system is overhauled and replaced by something else, a different committee, which would have a Conservative majority. And as you can imagine, Labour have been pretty outraged, saying that this takes us back to the bad days of Tory sleaze. So big row in Parliament coming up.
Yeah, and we've got Labour's Lisa Nandy coming on the programme in just a few minutes' time, so I'm sure to be putting that to her. Thanks very much, Tamara. Well, despite the pandemic and a global economic downturn, Greece is one of the few countries which has kept its tourism industry in business. Official figures show that visitor numbers there were down just 35%, and a complete recovery is expected by next summer. Well, let's speak now to Vasilis Kikilis, the Greek Minister of Tourism. Minister, great to have you on the programme, and I suspect, given that which I've just said, you're quite pleased to be the Minister of Tourism for Greece at the moment.
Correct. Mr. Paterson, thank you very much for the invitation. I was the Minister of Health for the previous 2 years within the pandemic. It was a huge fight for us, but we were transparent, organised our health protocols, gave predictiveness, and the results paid off. And yes, checking out the English market, tour operators, airline companies, influencers from the UK and travellers, we're looking at a total comeback in 2022, which is very important for us because tourism is 25% of our GDP.
It is absolutely remarkable, particularly if you hit that 2022 goal. But, Minister, I do have to ask, have there not been any kind of knock-on effects from the tourists coming in and out of the country in terms of COVID? The natural assumption would always be that increased travel to and from a country would lead to increased COVID transmission.
Well, let me tell you that we took a calculated risk back in 2020, and against maybe all odds, the rest of the Mediterranean countries did not open for tourism. We did, with enhanced testing, multiple testing. We sent NHS workers, multiple NHS workers to our islands. We had guaranteed hotels, private physicians and doctors linked to our hotels. We did PCR tests and rapid tests. We organised it, and it paid off. So yes, of course, it's a huge difficulty because it's a pandemic. It's a global, huge crisis of public health. But I feel that if you're transparent and you're organised, and you have a vision, and you trust people to work with you, then that pays off. It wasn't easy, and of course, there are always obstacles. It's not on the automatic pilot, not at all. But we're confident, and it's not just us. There's huge work behind that. And let's not forget that if we talk about the English market, which interests us a lot. The Brits are travellers. They want to travel. They want to enjoy not just the sea, sand and sun, but the beauties of other countries. And they're most welcome in Greece.
Vasilis Kikilis, I'm afraid we are going to have to leave it there. We are just about out of time, but I perhaps can just squeeze in very quickly. Of course, COP26 going on at the moment. I mean, is tourism and travel sustainable in the longer term, particularly for a country like Greece?
That's a basic part of our strategy. Already the Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis set out our islands, our touristic islands, as green islands. We started with Astypalia. He's visiting Halki.
I am so sorry.
This is our goal.
Minister, I'm so sorry, I can't read a clock correctly. We are going to have to leave the interview there. I really appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll speak again in the future.
Thank you.
We'll be back after this.